The year is 1979. The location is a windowless concrete bunker deep within the Sevastopol naval base, the fortified heart of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. The air is thick with cigarette smoke, the acrid smell of ozone from hot electronics, and the palpable tension of men who hold the fate of an empire in their hands. This is the central command for a high-stakes wargame. But it is no ordinary exercise. On a massive glowing map screen, dozens of light symbols represent the full, terrifying power of the Soviet Navy. Squadrons of Tu-22M backfire bombers, their icons showing full payloads. Kirov-class battlecruisers, the pride of the fleet. Oscar-class submarines, silent hunters lurking in the digital depths. For 2 days, the exercise has been a resounding success. The objective, the complete annihilation of an American carrier battle group, the ultimate symbol of Western naval power. The Soviet strategy is brutal, elegant, and, in their calculations, unstoppable. It is not a duel. It is an execution. They call it time saturation asterisk. From the bombers, the cruisers, and the submarines, a single coordinated pulse of digital fire erupts. On the screen, over 100 red icons converge on the American fleet, a swarm of P-500 Basalt and P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles. Each one is a heavyweight killer, supersonic, armored, and intelligent. Some fly high, spotting targets. Others skim the waves, invisible to radar. They communicate with each other, a wolf pack of steel. The Soviet admirals watch with grim satisfaction. They know the American Phalanx CIWS system can, at best, stop 4 or 5 missiles. Their standard missiles can maybe stop a dozen more. But this is 100. The math is simple. The math is Soviet. At least 50 missiles will get through. The American carrier will die. The battle group will be annihilated. This is the cornerstone of the entire Soviet naval doctrine, perfected by the legendary Admiral Sergei Gorshkov. They cannot outbuild the Americans in carriers, so they have perfected the art of killing them. A senior captain, his face pale in the screen's green glow, inputs the final command. The simulations algorithm, loaded with the most recent intelligence from their spies in the West, begins to run the terminal phase. And then, the impossible happens. The American carrier group, which had been passive, suddenly erupts in a storm of light. But it's not the light of explosions, it's the light of interception. On the screen, the red icons of the Soviet swarm begin to vanish. Not 1 or 2, not a dozen. They are erased in clusters. 10, then 30, then 60. The wolf pack is systemically, electronically, and clinically dismembered. A stunned silence falls over the room. The admirals lean forward, their minds refusing to process the data. "Restart the sequence," one vice admiral commands, his voice a low growl. The technicians reset the parameters. The swarm is launched again. The same result. 90 seconds of simulation time. 100 missiles launched. 0 hits. The carrier symbol sails on, untouched, a ghost of American invincibility. "The intelligence file?" the vice admiral demands. "What new variable was added?" A young intelligence officer, trembling, steps forward. "Comrade Admiral, GRU reports a new American radar designation. We know very little. It is just a code name. We fed its hypothetical parameters into the system as variable A. Then the variable is wrong?" The Admiral snaps, slamming his hand on the console. "The algorithm is flawed. It is fantasy. No system can track 100 targets. No system can guide that many interceptors. It is not physically possible." He calls it fantasy. But for the first time, in this secret room, the men who command the Red Fleet feel a cold, unfamiliar sensation. Doubt. A seed of sheer, unadulterated terror. Because if the simulation is right, if this variable A is real, then everything they know about naval warfare is wrong. Their entire fleet, the bombers, the cruisers, the submarines, the billions of rubles spent is obsolete. The hunt for the answer to this impossible riddle had just begun. This is the reality of the Cold War. It wasn't just a standoff. It was a furious, hidden battle of innovation. The mysteries were real, and the stakes were the survival of the world. Here on Cold War Impact, we peel back the layers of these technological battles that define the modern age. If you want to understand why the world is the way it is today, you need to understand the secrets of this conflict. Subscribe to the channel, and don't miss an episode. The initial reaction in Moscow was not panic. It was denial. The report from the Sevastopol wargame was buried, classified as a data anomaly. The official conclusion was that the simulation's programmers, likely academics with no battlefield experience, had grossly overestimated the capabilities of a hypothetical American system. The admirals went back to their work, their confidence outwardly restored. But the phantom in the machine refused to disappear. Whispers began to circulate within the Soviet Navy's technical branches and the GRU's Directorate S, the department tasked with stealing foreign military technology. The whispers were not about a new radar. They were about something fundamentally different. The first concrete and utterly baffling piece of evidence came in 1980. A KGB asset, a low-level clerk working at the RCA Corporation's Missile and Surface Radar Division in Moorestown, New Jersey, passed along a stack of internal documents. They were mostly dry engineering reports, but one detail caught the eye of the Soviet analysts. It was a photograph of a test ship, the USS Norton Sound. Mounted on its superstructure was not a radar, not as they knew it. Soviet radar philosophy was built on massive, powerful rotating dishes. Their top dome and top steer radars were colossal, mechanically swept behemoths. They were strong, and they were simple. You could see them spin, physically throwing out beams of energy. This was different. The photo showed a flat, octagonal, pale grey panel. It didn't move. It looked dead. It resembled a piece of abstract, angular armor. What was it? A new type of heat shield? A communications array? The accompanying text was even more confusing. It was filled with arcane Western terms. Phased array. Passive electronic scanning. Beam. Steering. To the Soviet engineers, steeped in the tradition of heavy, mechanical engineering, it read like science fiction. They understood phased array in theory. The concept had been around for decades. Instead of a single moving dish, you used a face made of thousands of tiny individual transmitters. By minutely shifting the timing, the phase of the energy sent to each transmitter, you could steer the resulting radar beam electronically. This meant you could move the beam from one part of the sky to another in microseconds. No moving parts, no lag, no mechanical inertia. A conventional spinning radar might update a target's position once every 10 or 15 seconds. This new system, in theory, could update it 1,000 times in that same span. It could, in essence, look everywhere at once. This was the source of the data anomaly. This was variable A. The implications of this discovery were so horrifying that they were initially dismissed. The report was sent up the chain of command, from the GRU to the Central Committee's Defense Commission. The verdict was swift and damning, but not for the Americans. It was for the Soviet analysts. "Comrades," one general declared, "you are telling us the Americans have built a radar that requires a computer brain we cannot even conceptualize, a system that requires manufacturing tolerances we cannot match. You are telling us they have invalidated our entire missile strategy with a panel?" It was easier to believe it was a bluff, a piece of American disinformation designed to scare them. But the Soviet leadership was deeply pragmatic. They believed in numbers, in mass. Their entire doctrine was built on overwhelming force. The P-700 Granite missile was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. A 9-ton, 25-foot-long monster that could fly at Mach 2.5, carrying either a 1,600-pound conventional warhead or a 500-kiloton nuclear payload. It was, they believed, the single greatest ship killer on Earth. The idea that a single American panel could render a salvo of 50 Granites useless was not just strategically terrifying, it was personally insulting. And so, the official response was one of studied denial. The ghost, from the Sevastopol simulation, was compartmentalized. It was a technical curiosity, a Western boondoggle, an overly complex and unreliable piece of American fantasy. But in the secret design bureaus at Almaz, at MPO Kvant, at the Altair Naval Design Bureau, the engineers were not so sure. They were the ones who had to actually build the systems to defeat the Americans. And they saw the writing on the wall. If the Americans had truly solved the phased array puzzle, if they had married it to a high-speed computer, they had done more than build a new radar. They had built a shield, an impenetrable electronic fortress that could see in all directions at once. A fortress that could track every bomber, every missile, every fighter, and guide dozens of interceptors to their targets simultaneously. The admirals in Sevastopol had been right to be afraid. The simulation wasn't flawed. It was a prophecy. While the admirals in Moscow slept, comforted by their denial, the men in the design bureaus began to have nightmares. They weren't fighting a new American radar. They were fighting the future, and it was a future for which they had no answer. The phantom of Sevastopol did not stay buried. It began to haunt the Soviet high command, emerging not as a single coherent threat, but as a series of disturbing, disconnected fragments. The great paranoid mechanism of the Soviet state, the KGB, the GRU, and the vast bureaucracy of the military-industrial complex began to grind, turning its full attention to this American enigma. The investigation was not a coordinated effort. It was a scramble, a dozen different agencies hunting for the same ghost, all of them hoarding their data, all of them terrified of being the one to deliver the bad news. The GRU's Directorate S, the technology thieves, were the first to find tangible, terrifying clues. Their assets in Japan, monitoring the flow of commercial electronics to American military suppliers, reported something alarming. The US Navy was buying computer processing chips, specifically the new Intel 8080 and Zilog Z80 microprocessors by the ton. To the Soviet analysts, this made no sense. These were toy processors, designed for hobbyist computers or industrial controllers. The Soviet military believed in real computers. Their Elbrus mainframes were massive, power-hungry beasts that filled entire rooms, built for singular, powerful calculations like cracking codes or plotting missile trajectories. Why were the Americans buying millions of toy brains? A GRU analyst, in a report that was initially dismissed as fantasy, proposed a radical theory: distributed computing. The Americans weren't building one giant, centralized brain. They were building a network of hundreds of smaller, faster brains, linking them together, giving each one a specific, simple task. One chip to manage one radar transmitter, one chip to track one incoming target, one chip to guide one interceptor missile. They were building, he wrote, a collective intelligence, a silicon hive mind. This was a manufacturing and programming concept so far beyond the Soviet industrial base that it was again deemed unreliable. The Soviet system was built on mass and scale. The American system was being built on miniaturization and integration. It was a philosophical divide, and the Soviets were on the wrong side of it. While the GRU hunted for chips, the KGB's first chief directorate, the PGU, hunted for human intelligence. They activated assets across NATO, from shipyard workers in Pascagoula, Mississippi, to low-level attachés in Athens. The reports that came back were contradictory and only deepened the mystery. A shipyard welder in Mississippi, working on a new class of cruiser, reported seeing workers install massive, prefabricated blocks into the superstructure. He described them as dead rooms, filled with racks and racks of electronics, but with no rotating machinery. He said the ship looked unfinished, like they had forgotten to install the radars. An officer in the Greek Navy, observing joint NATO exercises, filed a report that was flagged by his KGB handler. He described an American ship, the USS Ticonderoga, sitting in the middle of a complex live-fire drill. The American ship, he noted with confusion, did not seem to be participating. Its main radars were not spinning. It just sat there. And then, the sky filled with missiles, drones, rockets and torpedoes, all fired from different ships and planes. The Greek officer watched, waiting for the American ship to defend itself. Instead, he saw the other ships in the battle group, the destroyers, the frigates, suddenly come alive. Their guns and missile launchers fired with perfect, inhuman coordination. Targets were blasted out of the sky. It was, the officer wrote, as if the dead American cruiser was a conductor and the rest of the fleet was its orchestra. It wasn't just defending itself, it was managing the entire battle space for everyone. This report sent a shockwave through Soviet naval intelligence. This wasn't just a new radar. This wasn't just a new computer. This was an entirely new doctrine. The Soviets had built their fleet on the concept of the specialist. The Slava-class cruiser was a missile carrier. The Udaloy-class destroyer was a submarine hunter. Each ship was a powerful but blunt instrument, designed for one job. The Americans, it seemed, had built a network. This realization began to build a legend, a bogeyman inside the Soviet fleet. Sailors on Soviet trawler ships, spy vessels disguised as fishing boats, would shadow American battle groups for weeks, their electronic sensors pointed at the new, angular American cruisers. They would listen. And the silence is what terrified them. Soviet electronic warfare was built on noise. Their radars blasted powerful, crude pulses of energy. You could hear them, you could jam them, You could track them. The new American ships, however, were eerily quiet. They used low probability of intercept frequencies. They hopped their signals across the spectrum. Sometimes, they didn't seem to transmit at all, instead using the signals from other ships, planes, or even satellites. To the Soviet sensor operators, the American fleet had become a ghost. This led to a flurry of wrong conclusions, each one more desperate than the last. The first theory was that it was a laser. The sudden, instantaneous kill of missiles in the Sevastopol simulation led some to believe the Americans had perfected a directed energy weapon. This theory gained traction because it fit the Soviet mindset, a single, powerful superweapon. They immediately began pouring billions of rubles into their own laser defense programs, a costly and fruitless dead end. The second theory was that it was a new form of electronic jamming. They believed the Americans weren't shooting down the missiles, but blinding their guidance systems with a new, powerful form of electronic warfare. This, too, seemed logical. The Soviets knew their electronics were a generation behind. They rushed to harden their missile seekers, adding new filters and shields, but they were hardening them against a threat that didn't exist. The third and most paranoid theory was that it was a submarine. Some in the high command, particularly the old guard officers of the Brown Water Navy, simply refused to believe a surface ship could be invincible. The ghosts in the simulations, they argued, must be a new class of ultra-quiet American hunter-killer submarine, like the new Los Angeles class, operating in concert with the surface ships and spoofing the data. They argued for more anti-submarine ships, diverting resources from the real threat. All of these theories missed the point. They were looking for a thing, a new radar, a new missile, a new laser. They could not comprehend that what the Americans had built was not a thing, but a system. It was a concept, a new way of thinking about war. They were looking for a better sword, but the Americans had built an invisible shield. A shield so advanced, it could also be the sword, directing the entire fleet's fire with the speed of light. This was the bogeyman. It wasn't a monster. It was a brain that saw everything, knew everything, and could react 1,000 times faster than any human admiral. And it was now at sea, pointed directly at the heart of the Soviet Union. While the Soviets hunted ghosts in the quiet, pine-barren shielded suburbs of New Jersey, the Phantom was being born. The location was not a secret underground bunker or a remote desert test site. It was a sprawling, unassuming corporate campus in Moorestown, New Jersey, the headquarters of RCA's Missile and Surface Radar Division. It was here, far from the admirals and the politicians, that a quiet, parallel war was being fought by men in white shirts and pocket protectors. And they were losing. In the mid-1960s, American naval dominance was a given. But by the early 1970s, that dominance was on the verge of total collapse. The threat was not theoretical. It was a mathematical certainty. The threat was the Soviet saturation doctrine. The US Navy's own wargames, run on their most advanced computers, produced the same horrifying result that Sevastopol would later see, only in reverse. The American admirals knew, with chilling certainty, that their carrier battle groups were little more than high-value target practice. They called it the 3-minute war. From the moment a Soviet Bear or Badger bomber spotted a US carrier, a clock would start. Within minutes, squadrons of Tu-22M backfire bombers would be wheels up, their bellies full of AS-4 Kitchen missiles. Simultaneously, Kirov and Slava-class cruisers and the terrifying Oscar-class submarines would maneuver into firing position. Then, the swarm, 100 missiles, all screaming towards the carrier from different directions, at different altitudes. Some, like the Kitchen, came in at Mach 4, a blistering, unstoppable dive from 80,000 feet. Others, like the Granite, were sea-skimming, wave-hopping Terminators, nearly invisible to radar. The American fleet's defenses were a joke in the face of this. Their radars, the SPS-48 and SPS-49, were powerful, but they were mechanical. They were great, spinning dishes like lighthouses. They could scan the sky once every 10, maybe 15 seconds. In that blink, a Mach 4 missile could cross 20 miles. They were, in effect, blind. Worse, the entire defense system was run by humans. A radar operator in a dark room would see a blip. He would call out, "Vampire, vampire," over a headset. A weapons officer would have to manually designate the target. A different radar would have to lock on. A missile would be fired. The entire sequence, from detection to launch, could take 30 seconds. Against 100 missiles arriving in a 3-minute window, this system was not just inadequate, it was suicidal. The Navy was facing extinction. They needed a miracle. They didn't just need a new radar or a new missile. They needed to reinvent naval warfare. They needed to take the human out of the detect-to-kill loop. They needed to build a system that could see everywhere, at all times, and react at the speed of light. They needed, in essence, to build a god. The man tasked with this impossible quest was a brilliant, famously curmudgeonly, and utterly relentless Navy captain named Wayne E. Meyer. Meyer was not a typical battleship admiral. He was an engineer, a Sparky. And he saw the problem was not one of hardware, but of philosophy. "We are building ships," he argued, "but the Soviets are building systems of attack. We must build a system of defense." RCA, the company that had given America the color television, won the contract. They were tasked with building the Advanced Electronic Gunnery Integration System. The acronym, AEGIS, was a happy accident. AEGIS, in Greek mythology, the impenetrable shield of the god Zeus. The name was a statement of intent, and what they built in Morristown would change the world forever. They didn't just solve the problem, they created a technological leap so vast it would take the rest of the world 3 decades to even begin to catch up. The ingenuity of AEGIS was not in one single invention, it was a system of systems, a perfect, deadly fusion of 3 revolutionary concepts. First was the eye. This was the answer to the Soviets' dead panel photo. It was the AN divided by SPY-1 radar. The SPY-1 was not a radar, it was an event in physics. Instead of one spinning dish, the SPY-1 was comprised of 4 flat, octagonal faces bolted to the ship's superstructure. Each face was a phased array, a dense honeycomb of 4,096 individual solid-state transmitters. A spinning radar was a flashlight, sweeping a beam around a dark room, hoping to catch a burglar. The SPY-1 was a light bulb, instantly illuminating the entire room, in all directions, from floor to ceiling, permanently. It had no moving parts. The beam was steered electronically, its phase shifted by a computer. It could fire a beam in one direction then, in 1 microsecond, fire a beam in a completely opposite direction. It wasn't just looking for targets. It was creating a 360-degree, 200-mile radius bubble of pure energy, and any object that entered that bubble, from a high-flying bomber to a low-skimming missile to a flock of birds, was instantly acquired, catalogued, and gripped by the system. It could track a baseball, thrown from 100 miles away, and it could do this for 200 baseballs simultaneously. Second was the brain. This was the answer to the GRU's toy processor mystery. The SPY-1's eye was generating an ocean of data so vast it would have melted any single computer in the world, Soviet or American. So, RCA didn't use one computer. They used 16. This was the distributed computing the Soviets couldn't grasp. The Americans, masters of commercial miniaturization, linked dozens of smaller, faster, more reliable computers into a federated network. It was the silicon hive mind. One system, the command and decision, C&D, was the strategist. It took all 200 tracks from the SPY-1 and, in a nanosecond, identified them. Is it friendly? Is it a bomber? Is it a missile? Is it a threat? It would automatically prioritize the list, from most lethal to least lethal. Another system, the Weapons Control System, WCS, was the assassin. The C&D would hand off the target list, and the WCS would instantly calculate the perfect kill solution for all of them. It would decide, that backfire bomber at 80 miles, assign a standard missile. That sea-skimming granite at 10 miles, assign the phalanx cannon. That other missile at 40 miles, assign the other cruiser's missile. This was the orchestra the Greek officer had witnessed. The AEGIS ship wasn't just defending itself, it was commanding the entire battle group's defenses, automatically, within human speed. Third, and most critically, was the sword. This was the detect-to-kill chain. AEGIS automated the entire process. The SPY-1 sees the target. The C&D identifies it as hostile. The WCS assigns the brand new Standard Missile 2, SM-2. The missile leaps from its vertical launcher. But here was the true genius. The SM-2 didn't even need its own radar. The entire time it was in flight, the SPY-1 radar would grip it, sending it guidance updates via datalink course corrections, speed adjustments. The missile was flying dark. Only in the last 2 seconds of flight would the AEGIS ship paint the target with a separate high-powered illuminator radar. The missile would see the LASER dot and dive in for the kill. The Soviet missile would have no idea it was being targeted until it was already dead. This was the Phantom. This was the ghost in the machine. It was a shield, a brain, and an assassin, all wrapped in one. A system that could see everything, track everything, and kill everything, all at once. And in 1983, the first AEGIS cruiser, the USS Ticonderoga, quietly put to sea. The monster the Soviets had been chasing was finally loose. The greatest leap in naval warfare since the aircraft carrier was now floating off their coast, and they were still trying to figure out if it was a laser or a submarine. The denial, the whispers, the desperate, flawed theories, they all evaporated on one single catastrophic day, the day the Phantom finally showed its face. The confrontation was not a climactic naval battle in the North Atlantic. There was no thunderous exchange of missiles between fleets. The reveal, when it came, was far more modern and far more terrifying. It arrived as a sterile, deeply classified after-action report, placed on the desk of the Chief of Soviet Naval Intelligence in Moscow. The date of the incident was July 3rd, 1988. The location, the hot, tense, and contested waters of the Persian Gulf in the Strait of Hormuz. The world knew of the incident. It was a global tragedy, a shocking headline. The American AEGIS cruiser, USS Vincennes, had shot down Iran Air Flight 655, a civilian Airbus, a 300, killing all 290 people on board. To the world, it was a horrifying, almost incomprehensible blunder. A case of trigger-happy Americans, of faulty intelligence, of the terrifying fog of war. But to the Soviet analysts who read the classified data, gleaned from their own signals intelligence, SIGINT posts in the region, and reports from their Lyra-class spy trawlers, the incident was something else entirely. It was not a blunder. It was a demonstration. It was the single most terrifying display of raw, cold, and inhuman capability they had ever witnessed. Their analysts in Moscow didn't care about the Vincennes captain's justification. They didn't care about the political fallout. They cared about the timeline. They cared about the physics. And the physics they saw laid out in the report made their blood run cold. This is what the Soviet admirals saw and why it broke them. The USS Vincennes was, at the time, engaged in a high-intensity surface battle with small, fast Iranian gunboats. Its decks were vibrating from the recoil of its own 5-inch guns. It was, by all definitions, in the chaotic heart of a close-in fight. At 10:47 a.m., in the middle of this gun battle, Iran Air Flight 655 took off from the nearby Bandar Abbas airport. The Vincennes' SPY-1 radar, the dead panel the Soviets had once dismissed, instantly acquired the aircraft as it lifted off the runway. It was one of more than 40 contacts the eye was tracking at that exact moment. The brain of AEGIS, the command and decision system, immediately catalogued the new target. It noted its position, its speed, its altitude. And, because the aircraft was ascending from an airport inside Iran and squawking a civilian transponder code, the system correctly tagged it as unknown, assumed civilian. But the human operators, stressed, in combat, and primed to expect an attack, made a different assumption. They believed it was an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, a fighter jet the Americans had sold to the Shah of Iran decades prior. They believed it was diving to attack their ship. This is where the Soviet analysts' terror began. The Vincennes operators began to challenge the unknown target over military radio. The Airbus, on a civilian frequency, did not respond. The AEGIS system, meanwhile, just continued to work. It didn't care about the fog of war. It didn't panic. As the human operators grew more frantic, the C and D system simply kept updating the target's data. Target is ascending. Target is on a commercial air corridor. Target speed is consistent with an A300. The ship's captain, relying on his panicked human reports rather than his own ship's brain, made the fatal decision. He declared the target hostile. At 10:54 a.m., just 7 minutes after the Airbus had taken off, he gave the order to fire. The WCS, the assassin, had been waiting. It had been holding a kill solution on the Airbus and on every other contact in the sky from the moment they were detected. The instant the captain gave the consent, the system acted. It didn't need to lock on. It didn't need to spin up a radar. It instantly selected two standard missile, 2 seconds. It instantly launched them from its vertical launch system. The Soviet analysts noted the launch time. Then they noted the target destruction time. The missiles had traveled over 10 miles. The entire sequence, from the captain's yes to the 290 deaths, was over in less than 40 seconds. The shock in Moscow was profound. It was a wave of pure, systemic horror. They finally, truly, understood. They realized that the Sevastopol wargame had not been a fantasy or an anomaly. It had been a conservative estimate. They realized the blunder in the Persian Gulf was, for them, a worst-case scenario come to life. The Americans had a system so powerful, so fast and so lethal that it could accidentally wipe a civilian airliner from the sky in the middle of a separate, chaotic gun battle without even breaking a sweat. The AEGIS brain hadn't even been stressed. It had simply classified one target out of dozens and, when told to, had effortlessly executed it. The Soviet admirals realized, in that moment, what this meant for their saturation doctrine. Their entire naval strategy, the swarm of 100 missiles, was a child's fantasy. If AEGIS could track an A300 in a cluttered air corridor, it could track a P700 Granite in the open ocean. If it could guide 2 missiles to a kill in seconds, while also fighting a gun battle, it could guide 80 missiles to a kill during a full-scale swarm. The Phantom was real. The variable A from the simulation was not just a radar or a computer or a missile. It was a fortress. A single American ship, they now knew, could sit off the coast of Murmansk and by itself shoot down every single plane, missile and bomber the Red Banner Northern Fleet sent at it. And the Americans weren't building one. They were building 20, then 50. The response in Moscow was one of sheer, unadulterated panic. The veil of denial was ripped away, replaced by the horrifying naked truth. They were no longer in a competition. They were in a slaughter. Their countermeasures, which had once seemed so logical, now looked pathetic. Their first futile response was simply mass. If 100 missiles will not work, the old guard admirals argued, then we will build a ship that fires 20 Granite missiles at once. We will build the Slava-class cruiser. This was the Slava, an AEGIS killer, a missile battleship. It was a desperate, brutish, and utterly Soviet solution. And it was completely useless. The AEGIS system on a USS Ticonderoga would see the Slava from 250 miles away. The Slava, a massive, non-stealthy block of steel, lit up on radar like a burning cathedral. The Slava's own Granite missiles had a range of only 190 miles at best. It was a math problem a child could solve. The Slava AEGS killer would itself be killed by American Harpoon or Tomahawk missiles, fired from the Ticonderoga from 100 miles outside the Slava's own firing range. The Aegis killer would never even get to fire its weapons. It was a suicide ship. Their second, more desperate, response was speed and stealth. They poured their last remaining rubles into designing new missiles. Missiles that flew faster, at Mach 5. Missiles that were stealthy, made of new materials. Missiles that could weave and pop up at the last second. It didn't matter. They were trying to outsmart a computer. They were trying to outfly the speed of light. The SPY-1 radar didn't care if the missile was stealthy. It was still a physical object, and the bubble of energy AEGIS created would find it. The brain didn't care if the missile weaved. The WCS could calculate a new firing solution 1,000 times a second. The faster the Soviets built the sword, the faster the Americans perfected the shield. The Soviet admirals were trapped. They were horrified. They had spent 30 years and the entire wealth of their nation building a navy of saturation attackers. And in one day in the Persian Gulf, they learned, in the most tragic way possible, that their entire fleet was obsolete. They were kings of a type of warfare that no longer existed. The true impact of the AEGIS system is not measured in the number of missiles it shot down in combat. It is measured in the number of missiles never fired. It is measured in the cold, deafening silence of the Soviet High Command, as they came to a collective, soul-crushing realization: the Cold War at sea was over, and they had lost. The horrifying truth, laid bare by the Vincennes incident, was that their entire naval strategy, the product of 30 years of national effort and hundreds of billions of rubles, was a complete and total failure. The saturation swarm was a fantasy. Their AEGIS killer ships were floating coffins. Their entire fleet, from the backfire bombers in the sky to the Oscar submarines in the deep, had been rendered obsolete, not by a bigger missile or a thicker hull, but by a thought. The final, brutal verdict, the killer statistic, was not one of combat, but of production. As the Soviet economy began to crack and groan under the strain of this new, impossible arms race, the Americans did not just build one AEGIS shield, they industrialized it. First came the 27 ships of the Ticonderoga class. Each one by itself was capable of defending an entire carrier battle group from a full-scale Soviet swarm. Then, as the Soviet Union itself began to falter, the US Navy unveiled its masterstroke, the Arleigh Burke class destroyer. This was the final nail in the coffin. The Arleigh Burke was smaller, cheaper, and more advanced than the Ticonderoga. It was a mass production model of the AEGIS system. The Americans didn't just have 27 of these ships. They began building 75 of them. The Soviet Union, in its entire desperate response, had managed to build only 3 of its lumbering, flawed Slava-class Aegis killers. The final tally: over 100 American AEGIS, capable ships, versus 0 effective Soviet counters. This was not a failure of tactics, it was a failure of philosophy. It was the great, systemic collapse of the Soviet model, played out in steel and silicon. The Soviets were masters of imitation and scale. They could see an American B-52 bomber and, through sheer brute force engineering and espionage, create their own Tu-95. They could see a Minuteman missile and build their own SS-18. They were brilliant at solving known problems. But Aegis was not a problem they could solve. It was a concept. It was the product of a different system of thinking. The Soviet Union, with its top-down, centralized, military-first economy, built muscle. It built the P-700 Granite, the largest, fastest anti-ship missile in the world. It built the Kirov-class battlecruiser, the largest warship in the world that wasn't a carrier. It was an empire of hardware, but Aegis was software. It was a brain, built by an American system that was decentralized, chaotic, and driven by commercial innovation. The I of AEGIS came from RCA, a company that sold televisions. The brain of AEGIS was built from microprocessors designed by Intel and Zilog, companies that, just a few years later, would be selling toy computers to high school students. The Soviets were trying to solve a 21st century problem of information warfare with a 20th century solution of more firepower. They were trying to defeat a hive mind of microprocessors with a bigger warhead. They were building a better sword, while the Americans had perfected an invisible, impenetrable shield. This was the true legacy of the AEGIS system. It was not just a weapon, it was a verdict on an entire way of life. It proved that an open, innovative, and commercially driven society could outthink and outbuild a closed, secretive, and centralized one. The grand, nuclear-powered battlecruisers of the Red Banner Northern Fleet ships like the Kirov and the Frunze were not defeated in battle. They were simply rendered irrelevant. They sailed the seas as the most powerful, magnificent, and expensive museums in naval history, dinosaurs of a bygone age, their granite missiles silent in their tubes. They were built for a war that had already been lost, on a simulation screen, in a windowless bunker in Sevastopol in 1979. The ghost in that machine was real. It was not a data anomaly. It was a prophecy. It was the sound of the American century, a century defined not just by industrial might, but by the mastery of information itself. The war for the seas was not won by the nation with the most steel. It was won by the nation that could think the fastest.